Jim O'Neill, in your latest paper written together with Alessio Tezzi, you look at the global economy's rapid transformation. What are the large-scale tectonic shifts at play here?
Well, as we show in the core and the start of the paper, the scale of changes going on in world trade are almost, if not definitely, unprecedented since we had modern global economic data. And at the core of it, the rise of China, not just as an exporter but also as an importer, is particularly critical. But I don't think people truly realise the scale of change that's taking place.
There's this idea that the BRICs economies, which you brought together under the acronym 12 years ago, are perhaps an old trend, and now we're talking about Mexico, we're talking about Nigeria. Are the BRICs countries still a force to be reckoned with?
I think the 4 BRIC countries in the next 30 years will be the 4 largest so-called emerging economies. And even while there are other emerging economies that are interesting and exciting, including the so-called mint countries, it's very unlikely that any of them are going to be as big as any of the BRIC countries, despite some disappointments in the likes of Russia, Brazil and India. But they're still going to be a lot bigger than these other places. So for people to dismiss their global economic relevance, I think is a mistake. As of the end of last year, although we haven't got final data for them all, Brazil will be the 8th largest economy in the world, Russia the 9th, and India 11th or 10th, 11th or 12th. So it's quite a gap between them and any of the others. And I can't see without ludicrously optimistic assumptions about Mexico and Indonesia that any of these others could get to be as big as theirs.
What about the idea that China is somehow a threat to the global economy?
Imports from China for Europe grew sharply, and with it, the European trade deficit with China. The lasting impression of China has stuck with that evidence, despite the fact more recently, now over a year, the European trade balance with China has started to improve. That reflects better exports to them as well as weaker imports. Now, we don't really know all the reasons why exactly that's happened. Some of it might be because of the degree of weakness of demand in troubled European countries, but it's also probably something more to do with the growth of Chinese demand and their wealth, as well as China not being quite so competitive with the rest of the world as it once was. And I think this is a really important thing for people in Europe to focus on, because it's my guess for the next decade, China's going to be more of an opportunity rather than a threat for many European countries.
Of course, all this external competition is helping to drive growth in Europe, but is it in a sense also inspiring deeper economic and monetary union?
If you take these dramatic changes going on in world trade, superficially they create an even bigger threat to European monetary union than the ones that we've already had the past few years, because in principle the rationale for such a monetary union depends on all the countries in it doing predominant amounts of their trade with each other, and yet we're moving into a world where the biggest trade partners are outside the monetary union. So what is the point of this thing? For so-called European monetary union skeptics, this is yet more evidence that the thing can't survive, won't survive, and the quicker we get rid of it, the better. I'm not sure if I would necessarily agree with that, partly because, of course, when European Monetary Union was created, it was for perhaps a bit more than just being an efficient place for trade. It was to try and solidify post-war relationships between core European countries. And my angle on it is if you want to have people believing that it's permanent, why not use this pressure to actually go even further?
You're predicting that by the year 2020, the global economic landscape will have changed dramatically. So how can organizations and bodies like the G7 and G20 remain relevant?
Well, one of the main reasons why we've written this paper is that against this background of such dramatic change, if governance doesn't change, then they won't be relevant. You take the G7 as being the most obvious example. It's still a club of so-called rich industrialized countries. Three of them share the same currency, therefore they share the same monetary policy. They effectively have now imposed on them the same framework for fiscal policy. China is bigger than Germany, France and Italy combined. How can we have a mindset where we think the G7 is relevant for global governance, where those three countries are in it and China's not? It's ludicrous. The G20 has sort of taken over to accommodate China and some of these other big emerging economies, but that's big and cumbersome, and in fact includes 29 countries, and you can't really get much stuff done. So that's sort of legitimate because it represents probably 90% of global GDP, but it can't really be an effective organisation to get stuff done because it's just so big. We need to have much better representation at the IMF. China, even when they implement what was agreed in 2008, will still only have the third voting share and seats as such inside the IMF, behind Japan and the US. China's twice the size of Japan today. And so if the IMF wants to be this legitimate organisation at the best of global economic governance, it's got to change a lot more, which means Western countries, particularly European ones, giving up more than they seem to be prepared to do so.